Welcome back, everyone. I already moved on to this slide. This was already in my presentation. Apologies to our token males in the crowd. I was just reflecting on how happy it makes me. Like, really, if you let me, I would stand up here and drone on for a week. And I just ran into an old family friend last weekend when I was at a conference in Denver, and I was telling her what I was up to and what I was talking about, and how excited I was about all these different projects. And she laughed and she said, "You know, little cat Hurley, you have not changed since you were 4.5 years old." And what's amazing to me is, like, you're all right here with me. We're all here. It's Saturday, and I've been talking for like 5 hours already. And you start asking me questions. You know, you all seem mostly awake. You've come back from lunch. And I was just thinking, you know, looking at the sponsors of this conference and thinking back to, you know, my 10-year-old self and my frustrated foster parent self and my frustrated shelter veterinarian self and then, like, my ambitious first resident in the world to study shelter medicine self and, like, all my hopes and fears for that. And to be standing here almost 10 years later, like, this pool of knowledge that we've built just in the last 10 years and building on what was known before. But the fact that, like, 10 years ago, and I was sponsored by the Maddie Fund, someone said, you know what, shelter cats matter enough that, like, we should actually give someone time to, like, think and learn about them. Like, 3 whole years. I had this gift of 3 whole years to just do that. And that's an amazing thing. Like, if you're thinking about the residency, you think it might be for you to live in poverty and think about cats 3 whole years. Or shelter dogs. Possibly bunnies. It's just amazing, like, what that has meant to me personally, and then looking at, like, PetSmart and the resources that we have here and the work that Dr. Newberry did on her PetSmart grant and on the ASPCA grant she's working under now, and this body of knowledge that's now come out of the other shelter medicine programs that are around the world, and, like, how different it is from just 10 years ago standing in a hallway with a bunch of carriers full of sick cats. And it's amazing to be here. It's great. So thank you all for just being as crazy as I am. But what does this mean about length of stay and shelter crowding? It doesn't take very long at all of just admitting a few more animals than are released to get a little overcrowded. And then that feeds on itself because the crowding itself will reduce adoptions, increase disease, and increase length of stay. And oftentimes, like, I had this experience when I worked at a shelter and we moved to a new shelter. It was about twice as big. And it was thought that, you know, we could house twice as many animals so we could save twice as many animals. But in fact, it only took us about 10 days of just taking in a few more cats than we released, which was just our general rule at that shelter. We just, in that community, we took in a few more cats every day than we released alive. And so we took a break from having to euthanize cats for 10 days. Then we reached a new steady state where we had twice as many cats to take care of every day than we'd had in the old shelter. There's many good things about the new shelter, but one of them was not that by having twice the space, we could save twice as many cats. Similarly, if it doesn't take that long to get into a situation of overcrowding, it doesn't take that long to get out. So, if we just released 2 cats every 30 seconds, if we had an adoption event where we got out 4 of the cats that were extra in this shelter and then imposed our new length of stay, we could change that. Even though in a year, maybe, you know, if we just sat here and did this all day, 200 people would pass through those 3 chairs. We'd only need to move 4 of them extra out in order to change the steady state. As long as we have inflow and outflow, those are always going to match ultimately, right? Intake and release, by one means or another, always has to be the same in the end. Right? You know, we just can't keep adding animals unless we add unless we keep so many that after a while they're just dying of old age in our care, sort of at the same rate that they're coming in. And that's just not practical, unless we somehow control the intake. So I just want to keep that in mind as we talk about making all of this work. So I don't think I really need to belabor this, but, certainly, we know that this is suffering. Whether it's a little kitty that came to us healthy and beautiful and ended up with upper respiratory infection, ulcers on its tongue, sore eyes, sneezing, hard time breathing, hard time eating. If it's a frightened little kitten, if it's a cat that's been in an impoverished cage for 3 years or 11, as someone told me on the break, or a cat that's, this is pre-porthole in a pretty nice cage, but it's not a lot of room left over for that cat by the time the litter box and food dish and everything is there, even if that's for a week or two. This is not what we want to give cats. And the reason we let it happen, and I hear this in all the questions that I get, is that we're afraid if we set a standard of care for cats, we can serve less cats over time. And really our challenge is to prove to ourselves and our stakeholders that that's not true, or honestly, if this is true, if somehow compromising the care of cats actually lets us save more lives, please, tell me those scenarios, because I do need to be aware of them, and then let's look at how compromising the care of cats can save more lives, and is there a way we could save those more lives and still not compromise the care of cats. Options to balance your budget. You can get better deals on good stuff that you need. Right? So you can get your stuff for less cost. Or you can get less of the good stuff that you want. Or you can get cheaper, crummier stuff. But you can't just buy more than you can afford. And you can't, buy stuff and then let it get repossessed. Ultimately, your limiting factor is your salary. What can you do about that? You can undertake a shelter medicine residency and cut it in half promptly. Or you can, get some additional training and increase it if you find that what you are earning is not enough to get all the good stuff that you really need. So, ultimately, the number coming in balances with the number going out. That can be over a day, a week, a month, a year, a decade. But ultimately, those numbers have to equal out. So we can take more efficient care of cats, we can take in fewer cats, or we can take less good care of each cat. Not actually an option to chronically take in more cats than you release. Also not an option just to euthanize more. That doesn't solve the problem of what happens in the middle. The type of outcome doesn't impact the number of outcomes. So although the fear is that we just euthanize more if we try and push more through the system, the only way that euthanizing more makes any difference is if you did it sooner than you would come to another outcome. There's nothing that says that euthanasia has to be the most efficient outcome that you can arrive at. So in terms of cost, when you're working with a public agency that maybe is more excited about cost than about budget, the lowest cost way of dealing with an unwanted cat other than just not taking it in is to take it in and immediately or almost immediately adopt it out and collect a fee. That's actually cheaper than taking it in and holding it for any stray period and euthanizing it. And in a lot of communities where there's a required stray holding period, in fact, taking in a cat and immediately spaying and neutering it and placing it back where it's found is going to be cheaper than taking it in and holding it under anything but the most inhumane conditions, euthanizing it and disposing of the body. So this is also really good news for cats. And this is not necessarily so easy for dogs because the notion of trap, neuter, release is more difficult for pit bulls than it is for kittens. And surgery is not quite as. But really, we need to just move away from this concern that we have. And encourage boards of directors to realize also that we're just not serving cats, we're not serving our mission, we're only serving ourselves in sort of a soft-minded approach to the problem when we don't make decisions and don't set a bar of a high standard of care for cats. Here's a daily reality at one shelter, and I like putting it on a day-to-day basis, where they take in 38 cats and kittens, and on that day they release to live 15 cats and kittens. And this is certainly something that can change over time, and this is a shelter at which it has changed since I took this photograph. This was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And in fact, on an ongoing basis, their live release rate for cats is higher than that. And here's a lot of the things that we know. These really make a difference over time. We've seen it make a tremendous difference for dogs in a lot of communities, and we've seen it make progress for cats in some communities, and notably in communities where there's been a shelter that's had a lot of resources to invest in some of these projects. But these things do take time and cost money. This is a somewhat limiting factor. And just in the way that our salary is somewhat of a limiting factor on how much stuff we can buy. This is the American Pet Product Manufacturer Association survey. This is from 2007, but it's held about steady for about the last 5 years or so, showing where people get their cats. And we saw a similar pattern, although in fact a higher percentage of pet owners getting cats from an animal shelter, but just about 30%. The study that was talked about yesterday. This is our piece of the pie, and it's somewhere around 20%. And in the latest surveys, rescue groups have also made a cut. But between this, still you can see it doesn't even make up quite a quarter of the pie. Here's a giant chunk of the pie. That's stray. This purple chunk of the pie. And this blue chunk of the pie is friend or relative. And this pink chunk of the pie, which is almost exactly the same size as our lavender chunk of the pie, is own pet bred at home. It's a very different pattern for cats than it is for dogs. What's going to happen to all these giant pie slices if we capture more of the market for adopters? Where will those pets go? Possibly they'll stay stray. Possibly they'll end up in a shelter for us to try and place. There's some advantages to that because then we can spay and neuter it. But just by capturing more of the adopting market share, we don't necessarily solve the problem. Here's a potentially unlimiting factor. This is the great news about cats, is that spaying cats is cheap, easy, and fun. I talked about this. Cheaper than holding and euthanizing when you count in the cost of holding. That cuts the free supply. So, if we could just eliminate even just own pet bred at home, if we could take less than half out of the cats getting taken from friends and relatives that are often unwanted litters of kittens, or if we could take just about half of the strays, we could double our market share just by cutting off other sources, and we're cutting off a free source. So right now we're competing with a free source of cats. For our cats, for whom we often charge some money, although we should think about, since these cats are free, maybe we should make our cats free. When you consider the cost of holding them for additional days, oftentimes the amount we can collect in adoption is less than it would cost us to hold them. Certainly if we hold them to the point that they get sick, and then we have to treat them. So, very cost effective, but not instant or free. So, meaningful change takes time, costs money. What are we going to do in the meantime, the cats that are coming to the door of the shelter? I think we've been through this. In which community will more unwanted cats be born today? We don't know. Depends on their spay-neuter programs, right, and their education programs. However many cats they have in the building is not going to determine how many unwanted cats become in need of homes in their community that day. But certainly, one shelter might have more resources left over to do preventive work than another shelter that's up to their eyeballs in cats. It's important to say that good adoption programs are a really important sort of loss leader for preventive programs. So we know that the real results are probably from spay-neuter, especially for cats, but people want to support an adoption program. And even we, I know that the best work that I can do is to stay home and write chapters and work on permanent resources. But what I love is coming to conferences and talking to people, and what I honestly love is going to shelters and just like getting my hands dirty and taking some kittens home and being part of the actual animal part of the process. So I'm not saying that an adoption program isn't a really important part of an overall community health effort, but that you want to invest the right amount of resources in your adoption program and not get confused and think that you can adopt your way out of the situation without also having a significant component of spay-neuter and other preventive programs to keep animals in their homes. So same with which shelter will adopt out more cats. We don't know. We think from the science of choice that actually maybe it's going to be on the shelter on the right-hand side that has sort of fewer cats presented in a more appealing environment. The cats are probably less stressed. And we don't know in which community more cats will be euthanized because that depends on the difference between the number of cats admitted to all the shelters in that community and the number of cats released alive. But what we can say for sure is what are each cat's chances for good welfare on each day. And what I see and what I think is one solution towards sort of against our impulse to take on more cats at once than really is productive and helpful is to set a standard of care for each cat and just hold to that standard. And, it's just like, for me, if I have a standard that I have to get stuff done on time, it keeps me from overcommitting quite as much as if I just said I would do all manner of things and let my deadlines go past and go past and go past. It's a painful lesson that I've learned. It makes me better, a better person to work with if I just stick with the deadlines and it limits somewhat how much I can overcommit myself. So part of just unraveling the whole problem of too many cats is just saying, well, we can't admit another one when all the chairs are full. We have to think of something else to do and get to that point where in has to match out at the time that 3 chairs are full or that 2 chairs are full, instead of waiting and getting to the point that in matches out anyway when 3 chairs have 6 cats. So here's a real life scenario, and I think this can be very helpful too. For those of you who are struggling with communicating with stakeholders, with board members, with volunteers, with your staff, with yourself, with whoever it is don't completely trust this. Try it and monitor it really carefully. Look at what your live release rate is, the number of adoptions that you do, the number of cases of upper respiratory infection that you have, based on the number of cats that are in the shelter each day or that are available for adoption each day. So track it. It's not hard to count. We have information on our website at sheltermedicine.com about how to count. How to count upper respiratory infection. You know how to count adoptions. And here's a shelter that you can see the number of cats and the live release rates and the dramatic relationship between reducing the number of cats and increasing the live release rate, and then conversely, increasing the live release rate and the speed to live release drops the number of cats in the shelter each day and feeds back on itself. This was a shelter that was tracking their upper respiratory infection rate at the time that they made the change. Part of that change was a feral cat release program that bypassed a stray holding period for the feral cats. So it actually got the cats out instead of after a stray holding period immediately. So that dropped their shelter census. But for the cats that remain, just by dropping the census of cats in the shelter and giving each cat more space, this was their upper respiratory infection rate before and steadily way above, here down this yellow line, way at the bottom, that's our bottom shelter. That's like our spectacular shelter. But they were like way an order of magnitude above all the other shelters, and they dropped down to like middle of the pack. And they sustained that. We eventually lost track of them, but they sustained that for as long as we tracked them after making that change. So just having that kind of information to share, to count upper respiratory infection cases before and after making a change that reduces cat density can help you explain this case. So talked again about this yesterday. Know where you currently stand in terms of your physical staff and program capacity. And it's really important. If you don't have enough space to meet to the potential of your community for adoptions, then that needs to be addressed. You can't fix that by any kind of efficiency with length of stay or any other clever planning if you don't have enough space to just get enough healthy cats up to adoption as could actually be adopted out in your community. So identify the difference between what you have and what you need, and then start tracking things in a way that really accounts not only for the number of cats released alive, the percentage of cats released alive, but also that actually looks at the health and welfare of each cat in the shelter each day. So oftentimes we don't count that, we don't report it, and so it becomes invisible, and we're not rewarded for success that we have in those areas. So if you can say our upper respiratory infection has dropped 75%, we've decreased our medical spending by $30,000 a year. Our cat, we used to have 20% of cats losing 10% of their body weight in the first 7 days in our care, and now that's down to 5%. These are things you really can measure, and it can help you make this case and express to your stakeholders. Here, here's what we see, here's what we live every day, but here's a way of explaining it to you and making it visible to you. And then when if you try going back to a crowding situation, then you can more easily make visible the impact of that. You can say, this month we had 317 more cases of upper respiratory infection than we had this same month last year when we had this policy of having every cage full instead of having 2 cages per cat, say. Change what you can today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about cost-benefit analysis for some different changes. And make a plan, articulate your plan for what you haven't changed yet, and address the difference between intake and live release. Probably a lot of you have, but it's surprising to me how many shelters are in how many communities. There's not a real good knowledge of what's the difference for that community between cat intake and cat live release. And for a lot of shelters, they're startled and sad when we show them the actual data for how many cats are coming in versus how many are being released alive. And that's, if you're a limited intake or no-kill shelter, then you know that the same number of cats are coming in as are being released alive over time, no matter how long they might stay in the middle. But if you're a shelter that's open intake, really graphically show that number to your stakeholders so that you understand that it's not a question of treating them all for upper respiratory infection or putting them all in cages. It's a question of maybe 3 or 4 cats coming in for everyone that's released alive. Or even if it's 4 cats coming in for every 3 that's released alive. It just explains the problem in a different way. This is not a problem that can be solved by an extra cage or an extra 50 cages or an extra 200 cages. Use your daily time and cost savings to change the long-term picture. So when you drop your population and you drop your medical costs and you don't have to treat cats for upper respiratory infection, take that time savings and don't just fire your staff. Use that to develop off-site adoption programs or to develop spay-neuter programs or to staff a hotline to help people whose cats are peeing outside their litter boxes and change the reasons why cats come into the shelter in the first place. And then revisit your metrics routinely to see if it works. And that way you can correct course easily. If it turns out you dropped your adoption population too far and you actually dropped your adoptions, or you forgot to hold adoption promotions because things seemed so uncrowded and pleasant. And so you forgot that you'd still need to make cats free or do a 2-for-1 special or do something extra in the summertime to get cats out more quickly. So it becomes a much lower risk proposition. Like, let's just try. If we don't want to cut holes in cages just yet, let's just try. Next time we do a big adoption event, let's not fill up right away. Again, let's just have 2/3 of the number of cats and let's track the number of adoptions and see if we can't hold to it. Or let's just designate one part of the population, maybe one room. We're going to give them better housing and make them available for adoption, try and move them through faster, maybe just kittens this year, or maybe just some kittens, maybe the foster returns. We're going to try this create a little fast track within an overall shelter where things tend to be slower and more crowded. Give some cats good housing and try and move them through quickly, and then see if you can expand that out to the rest of the population. So what do you have versus what do you need? I think we talked enough about that yesterday in terms of physical facility and sort of basic staff capacity, but also programmatic for cats that already happened to you. just to take some time to think about, well, what do you really need? You know, I've talked about your 15 minutes of care for basic cleaning and feeding. But what do you think, you know, if a cat is, maybe, like, set the time limit of, if a cat is with you for 2 weeks or less, every day, do you think it should have 5 minutes of just sort of friendly social time? Do you think it should have 10 minutes of out-of-cage time? You know, to really define programmatically what you think is fair and write it down. Brainstorm with your staff. What do you think that they maybe need if they are with you for longer than 2 weeks? Do you think maybe they should have half an hour of out-of-cage time? How could you make that happen? Do you think that they should have the opportunity to jump and pounce on things? And maybe you're going to keep them in a smaller cage until then, but you don't want them to go longer than 2 weeks without being able to pounce on something. Really think about, well, what do you need in terms of foster program? You don't need an infinite foster program, but, you know, if you're euthanizing kittens or having kittens get sick because they're staying in your shelter and not making it up to adoption or getting a big thing of URI before they make it up to adoption, how many foster homes would be enough to meet your capacity? Even if you're not there yet, at least you know where the bar is for you to try and reach. And what do you really need in terms of adoption? And this is a little bit tricky because you have to think about what comes in your community, and of those, you know, how many are easily adoptable? It sort of goes to what was being talked about last night, like how many would people who are sort of typical pet owners in your community, what percentage of them could easily be placed into homes, whereas for what percentage would it really be better to think of an alternative like a trap, neuter, and release program, but really define, like, what's the difference between the number of adoptions you're able to do now and the number you really need to be able to do. And oftentimes it's not all that much. And then think about that pie chart that I showed you and think about whether it wouldn't be easier to steal those from other sources of cats versus just trying to push your cats into homes instead of other cats. And at least marry those two programs. So putting your cats out more in the community and reducing the sources of other cats in your community. And then if in the moment you don't have the capacity to deliver the care that you really want to have, here it comes, you know, it's paycheck time. Either you can sort of increase your staff or skilled volunteers, or you can invest in housing that requires less time for cleaning and care so that you have more time to do the other things that you really want to do. Or you can increase your physical capacity, or you can decrease the amount of time each cat is in the organization's care, or you can decrease intake. So you have a lot of options other than continuing to provide not the kind of care that you want for each cat. So we talked about housing that requires less time and skill, and these are the components of housing that takes less time and leaves more time for other things that you want to do. Compartmentalized. Walk-in housing that's single housing or small group housing takes less time and skill to take care of every day. Anything that provides containment of litter boxes. Anything that provides a consistent carrier and hiding box just in terms of the time and skill that it takes to take care of it, not only the cat benefits, and just larger housing, all other things being equal. So, can you afford this type of housing? We will see. Which costs more? Free truck on the left, Prius on the right. So, miles driven per year divided by the truck on the left gets 10 miles a gallon. That's Dr. Wagner's truck, a friend of mine. I know that truck. Minus the miles driven per year divided by 50 miles a gallon times the cost of a gallon is the annual difference in the cost of those two cars. So, say you drive 25,000 miles a year, divided by 10 miles per gallon, minus 25,000 miles a year, divided by 50 miles a gallon, times $3 for a gallon, means it costs you $6,000 more a year, just in gas, to drive this truck versus drive this little car. So it would take you 3.7 years to make up the difference in cost, and then after that, there would be profit. And there are other costs associated with driving that ugly truck. So which costs more? Here's the actual upper respiratory infection rate associated with the shelters that had those two types of housing. And they actually tracked how many days they spent caring for sick cats with upper respiratory infection versus taking care of healthy cats. So one sick cat for one day equals one sick cat care day. And the shelter with the housing that I showed above, that's the more typical housing, had 1,460 care days in typical months and 722 care days spent on sick cats. So they're spending 1/3 of their cat care resources just taking care of cats with upper respiratory infection. This is a shelter that treated most of their cats with upper respiratory infection through to cure. On the other shelter, they were also a shelter that treated most of their cats, actually they treated all of their cats with upper respiratory infection through to cure. They had 2,637 healthy cat days, 21 sick cat days. So they were spending a tiny fraction of their overall cat care resource. The shelter that I showed you with the higher upper respiratory infection rate, so you can see over a period of a year, it was 23 to 33% of their care days per month. And it totaled in the year that we were tracking it, that this graph is shown for, 10,169 sick cat care days. We actually went through a little exercise, and I would love it if you guys would try this. So email sheltermedicine@ucdavis.edu if you want to try it. Just another way, it's not that it all comes down to dollars and cents, but that this can be another way to help stakeholders sort of understand it and understand it for yourself. We made this little chart where you can enter in your cat population and some of your costs, like your hourly wage for a veterinarian, for your animal care staff, your intake costs, so that you can get a sense of like how much it costs if you invest in intake and then lose a cat to euthanasia for upper respiratory infection, your transition costs, which is like cost to process a cat from movement to adoption, testing that you do, and you can tweak all of these numbers for processes that you do or that you don't do. And then you can enter in the percentage of cats that go through to adoption, that end up getting euthanized, and the cost of treating in-house. So we tried to make this pretty detailed because we used to try and say, well, what's the cost of treating one cat for URI for one day? Well, it's 23 cents worth of antibiotics, no big deal. But when you think about treating 30 cats for URI for one day, and you think, well, you've got to then have that whole room, and you've got to clean that whole room, and heat and cool that room, and maintain that part of the facility when you could be using that room for something entirely else. It really adds up. So with this shelter, we actually used a real shelter's real data. This is in a expensive community in California, and so it came to an estimated almost $40 a day, daily care cost. If you do a bad job, you can get it a lot cheaper. If you're in other communities, you might be able to get it cheaper. But they're actually a way that you can then calculate how long would it take to get your return on investment in new cages. So even if it doesn't work out exactly that way, I think it's really a valuable exercise to think through what is the cost of doing something now that's going to cost money versus not doing something now that's going to cost a little bit every day until we do something different. These are some other costs of upper respiratory infection and stress. And I talked about, the experience I had as a little kid of going to a shelter to adopt a cat and sort of being turned away from a shelter, scared off from shelter cats for the next 15 years, and instead getting a cat that didn't end up getting good care. And this is a letter to the editor of our local paper about some disaster that somebody had with their own cat that got upper respiratory infection, cost them $1,500 at the vet, and their other cat ended up dying. And that's obviously an exception. Usually it's not that bad, but that was in the paper, and that probably cost us a good number of adopters, potentially, for that shelter. And this article on the right is the effect, I can't even read it, the effect of housing and handling on the welfare, behavior, and adoption of domestic cats. And the results suggest that consistent handling combined with a range of improved housing options can improve the chances of adoption for adult cats, perhaps by reducing fear-related behaviors that make cats less attractive to adopters. So, by converting more cats from intake into adoption, we also reduce our costs because that's the most cost-effective way to manage a cat. So, maybe you can't afford not to do this. So here's the process of portholizing a cage. I've got a lot of questions, which I'm delighted about. One person asked, can you put corks in these? so that if you really, really need to, you can break them back down. As you can imagine, we're not a fan of putting corks. Like, we want to just, like, put the porthole in and commit. That's what cats should have. But if you need to, sometimes have the flexibility. If you're in a transition, someday you're going to have a bigger shelter where you can really give every cat two sides of a cage, or a big cage, or a condo, or something else that really more meets its needs. I've seen this done in a shelter where instead of making a PVC pipe porthole, a metal worker actually made a little metal lip, and then there's like a guillotine door that you can just slide in, so you can actually divide them up. You just have to make the lip on both sides because there's usually a gap between the cages, so you have to cover it up in some way. Or perhaps you can fashion a cork for these that can be easily disinfected, but we haven't managed it yet. But you can email us. So we've got this all written up in some detail, how to do this. And we've done it with fiberglass cages as well as with stainless steel cages. And you don't have to do it with all your cages. You know, you could start with just a bank of cages. But it's a great way of just providing, you know, with what you have now. You can do this for under $200 a cage to make this conversion. Start with what you have now and make a gradual transition. And that drops the number of cats that you have in the system at any one time, and hopefully will increase your number of adoptions. If you just don't have enough space. This is one of just like a few tragic shelters I've visited where the cages were considered too small to provide a litter box. So I think we talked enough about that. Just going to talk a little bit more about length of stay and some of the frequent places where length of stay gets hung up. So we have intake, we have an intake evaluation. Then we have a stray holding period. How many of you have a stray holding period? So quite a few. You have to do a stray holding period. Let's say that adds 7 days. How many is it for you guys? Oh, two or three. So that's great. I'm a fan of short stray holding periods or no stray holding periods for cats. Because there's no law that says that you couldn't still hold a cat for reclaim if you think it looks like it's got an owner, but it just gives you the flexibility to move a cat right on through. If you're pretty confident, like never in the history of your shelter has anyone come looking for their missing litter of 12-week-old kittens. Move those ones on through and have a little bit more time to hang on to the neutered cat or the cat that's got a collar on or is fat and just looks really like someone is going to come looking for it. So people, on average, might take a little longer to come looking for cats than they do for dogs. So it's ideal to hold cats that might have an owner for 5 to 7 days. But it's not ideal to hold cats that don't look like they're going to have an owner. If you only have a 2 or 3% reclaim rate, holding a whole bunch of cats for 5 or 7 days each is not a good use of resources, especially given that you can hold the ones that look owned. And, you know, most of the time you're going to have a sense of the cats that probably have an owner out there looking for them, and there's still nothing that says they can't come and get them if they're available for adoption. And then 7 days, that's our ideal time actually in adoption. And sometimes there's some things that have to happen before they move to adoption, right? There's like a move to adoption exam maybe. Maybe there's some testing. Maybe you test them for feline leukemia or FIV or do a behavior evaluation. Spay-neuter might have to happen before adoption. So what if there's just like, takes a day of delay time? Like we were just at a shelter where the staff couldn't do overtime. Shelter was open till 5. Staff was on till 5:30. And so the cats didn't get processed until the next day. So then the stray clock didn't start ticking until the next day. So it just added a day to about 25% of the cats that came in late in the day. Also, sadly, it added a day to how long it took for them to get vaccinated. Then what if they just kind of linger around in stray holding for another 3 days, waiting for space and adoption or waiting for someone to have time to evaluate them? So there's a delay there. And then you only have staff who can do the adoption exam on Wednesday through Friday, so there's a little delay there. And altogether, that adds up to another 7 days. So all of a sudden, we have 30% more cats in the shelter just from these little delays. So one thing that it's helpful for you to know is what's your mandatory average length of stay. So you can think about cat care days as like dollars, and you only have so many to give out. So calculate what is your humane capacity. You know, where do you want to keep things? And then calculate how much turnover time you need to maintain in order to sort of keep it at your humane capacity. And then at least you can know if you're always going over or what the cost is of little delays and what might be worthwhile to invest in to actually move cats through more promptly. Whether it's eliminating an exam that's required or letting that exam be done after the cat goes up for adoption or hiring and training more staff. So say you take in 3,000 cats times 360 days, 65 days in a year divided by 100 cat capacity. That means every cat has to be in the shelter for an average of 12 days. That doesn't mean that every cat will be in the shelter for 12 days. It means if one cat is in the shelter for 21 days, you're going to have to find some ways to borrow days from other cats and have them be in the shelter for less time. On the other hand, it means if you can get some cats in and out in 3 days, for each cat you do that for, you have 9 days to pass around to other cats that might need a little bit more time in the shelter system to get whatever they need to go find a home. How many of you know what your average turnover time needs to be in order to maintain a humane capacity? How many of you are going to go calculate that? Make me happy. Thank you. And then you want to see what capacity would you need for an ideal average length of stay. And for most shelters, if you have a holding period, then your ideal average length of stay is probably going to be around 14 days unless you're a shelter that's set up to do special medical or rehab or neonatal animal care. For an animal that comes in about ready to go for adoption and has to be held, then think about having enough capacity to hold every animal for 14 days. So that shelter that I just showed you that had to maintain a 12-day average length of stay, probably a little bit tight, and it would benefit them to expand their capacity somewhat. Think about the seasonal variation in capacity requirement as well. And this is so true for cats. So here is Mount Kitten at a shelter. And think about ways to increase shelter capacity that doesn't result in crowding during the summertime. So make use of outdoor space, porches, foster care, or have some housing that doesn't need to be used in the wintertime so you're not sort of forced to go over capacity and have a long-term stay to adoption in the wintertime when you really don't have the adoptions and the cats really to justify that, and you can have the sufficient capacity in the summertime without really compromising your housing. So here are some things that can systematically increase turnover time. So delayed intake, I talked about that. Mandatory holds. So if you can lobby to reduce or eliminate your stray hold, remember that that doesn't prevent you from still holding cats as strays, and it can really improve your flexibility. So that's a sort of counterintuitive thing that we've seen, where it feels like holding cats as strays is going to increase the reclaim rate, and so it's going to increase the live release rate. But in fact, we've seen shelters where they've been able to increase their live release rate when they've dropped their stray holding period for cats. Also makes it easier to do something like a feral cat or a sort of friendly feral trap, neuter, and release program. Medical evaluations and testing. And I think I'm going to talk more about these, so I'm just going to show you this list. Holding areas out of sight of adopters or a need to move animals to adoption areas. How many of you have cats in a holding area that adopters can't go to? So just sometimes opening those areas up to adopters if there's a way that you can safely do so. Sometimes it requires altering the shelter hours a little bit so that you can get those areas clean prior to opening to the public. But we've worked with shelters that maybe change their intake hours from 9 to 11 to give them time to get things cleaned up. And then just opening, especially your cat intake area, to the public. No touching, but we've seen that it's not a total disaster. And then people can at least fall for a cat while it's waiting for adoption instead of having to come up to adoption, and then if there's just no room or no one gets around to moving it up to adoption, at least it has some chance during its holding period for someone to select it out of that group of cats, and then you can designate it for surgery and testing and all the things that it might require. So list for yourself, what are all the control or delay points that a cat needs to get through? What are all the hurdles it needs to clear to get to the point of adoption? Like, go home and do this. And then for each thing, is it really necessary before making the cat available. So not a fan of just a random intake quarantine unless you're transferring from a very high-risk environment. So just eliminate those. Eliminate any kind of arbitrary holding period before putting a cat up for adoption. Don't try and revaccinate cats before making them available for adoption. And we don't need to have arbitrary treatment time. So, treat to recovery, but don't treat for 10 days if the cat is better in 5. So those are ways that you can just cut off some time from a cat's length of stay. Can it be done any sooner? So for skilled procedures that need to happen, make sure that staff is available to do that every single day, or at least every other day. So we've worked with shelters where they really drop their length of stay just by sort of changing scheduling so that some procedures that had to happen before a cat could go up for adoption could happen sooner. We worked with a shelter where they were doing their foster kitten return, spay-neuter surgeries on Sundays and then putting the kittens up for adoption on Monday. But what they had was a huge spike in kitten adoptions on Saturdays. So by just changing and having their foster kittens come in on Friday instead of Sunday, they adopted most of them out the following day instead of having them stay a week and then get adopted out the following Saturday. So just looking at your daily adoption pattern can help you determine where you need to staff up. If you have a lot of cats come in over the weekend, make sure that you have sufficient staffing on Monday to process them all through to the next step. Can it be done while the cat is available for adoption? So can it be available for adoption during holding, during treatment, either physically or via the web or photographs? And if delays in spays and testing are holding up movement of adoption, consider doing those post-adoption or post-selection. So not that you spay them after you let them go home and have some kittens, but that instead of just waiting for a cat to get spayed or neutered before you even make it available for adoption, just make it available for adoption if it gets selected, then go ahead and schedule the surgery. So we've known shelters where they're just sort of holding up on that process, and then the cat ends up getting sick and getting euthanized before it ever makes it up to adoption, so just go ahead and make it available in that case. And I think I've pretty much talked about this, but really don't underestimate the power of just a team of people going through the shelter, and it doesn't need to take a long time. Once you've done it once and sort of gotten the whole mess cleared up and animals are moving through smoothly, and just make sure for every animal that its ID is posted, that an owner's been contacted, microchips have been followed up on, that it's not waiting for behavioral or medical evaluations or medical procedures, move to adoption, rescue's been contacted. If it's going to be euthanized, then euthanasia. So it's not that we want to have that outcome instead of not having that outcome, but if we're going to have that outcome, having it promptly benefits the cat and benefits the population more than if it's delayed. And I think the most important thing is that there's just no limbo allowed. So every cat, every animal in a shelter every day needs to be where it is for a reason. And most importantly, animals cannot be in holding pre-adoption areas for no particular reason except that they're waiting for room to open up in adoption. So if that's the case, decisions need to be made to make room in adoption or find an alternative to that cat, whether it's released to rescue, sent to another shelter, or if there is no other option and a cat is going to be euthanized, euthanizing that cat sooner rather than later, because by the time room opens up in adoption, another cat is going to be waiting in line, and that's how we get the whole middle of the problem building up. Here's some resources for daily population management. So these are on our website, and again, if they disappear in the next few weeks, just let me know. And remember, plan other triggers for action to promote adoptions or limit intake or whatever it is that you do to control crowding now. Please, I think I've said this enough, don't use crowding and disease as an alternative to making either intake or euthanasia decisions. It takes a really long time to just wait for enough cats to get sick. It costs a lot. And disease tends to choose poorly, and it chooses too many, and it chooses the wrong ones. It chooses babies. And it reduces opportunities for rescue, transfer, and adoption because it costs the rescues, the transfers, the foster care parents so much more per animal that they aren't able to help you as much. So we want to invest in reducing intake as well as humanely invest in what happens in the middle. And one of the best ways we can keep on track is to measure parameters that indicate welfare and health. So this is measuring upper respiratory infections. But to monitor welfare, to avoid the endless arguments that we have. So, like it was spectacular to show the shelter their little orange solid line and their little orange dotted line, and like in case you were worrying that wasn't a good idea, yes it was. Or in case you were wondering, like, is it okay to let the cats run around and play after you finish cleaning for the day and you don't want to let them out in an exercise area? Let's just try it and see what it does to our upper respiratory infection rate. If you have an upper respiratory infection rate to compare to, you can try all kinds of things. You can try intranasal vaccination and see if it makes a difference compared to the same time period the previous year. You can try fast-tracking animals through to adoption instead of holding them for a 5-day stray holding period unless you're required to do that by law. You can try putting half as many cats up for adoption at once. You can try all kinds of things and see what effect it has on your upper respiratory infection rate as well as your adoption rate. So it can avoid those endless arguments. You can assess the effect of decisions and you can communicate to your stakeholders, hopefully, which helps you plan and justify additional investment. So, intake to outcome, health or behavior status changes. Probably, do all of you track intake health status? Pretty much. And do all of you track outcome health status? Do all of you track whether something happens in the middle? Like for no-kill shelters, probably if they get sick, they get better, they get adopted out, they probably are in the same health status unless they get better, they came in sick and they end up healthy. But it's probably not common that they come in healthy and they end up sick. So track that, graph it, and show how good a job are you doing of maintaining the status that the cats came to you with, if it's a good status, and how good a job are you doing at improving the status that they came to you with if they came to you unhealthy. And the same goes for behavior. If they came to you fearful and they left you friendly, track that. That's great. That means something you're doing is working. If they came to you friendly and they left stressed out of their gourds, track that. Something you're doing isn't working. So I have information on our website, and there's information in your notes about how to track disease rates so that you can track these kinds of happy green lines that show your upper respiratory infection rate. And I show that as, we often track URI as a marker for other diseases and for stress in the shelter. So you could do the same with panleukopenia, you could do the same with ringworm, but because there's so many more cases of upper respiratory infection, it's easier to see a difference when you're tracking that, because there's just a bigger difference between 300 and 200 than there is between 3 and 2. Time to recovery from upper respiratory infection. So if you're doing something that's going to reduce severity of disease, like a new vaccination program, then it's going to maybe not impact the number of cases that you have, but it might change the time to recovery. And if you could drop your time to recovery in half, that affects your costs, it affects your length of stay, and it affects your shelter crowding. So it may be a worthwhile investment, even if it costs a little bit of money, like an intranasal vaccine. So that's not hard to do. You just track the time of onset, and you track the time of recovery, and you track that over time. That's how we can now come to you and say, in 10,000 cases, we found that they mostly get better in 7 to 10 days. Of course, that's sometimes set by shelter policy, because they just say, well, after 7 days, they're done. They're better. Track your turnover time. Track your time from intake to outcome. Just track your time to adoption. Track your average and track your median, too, because if you have just a few cats that stay a really long time, it can throw off your average, so you really want to look at what most cats stay. Weight loss is easy. Death rate is a huge red flag. Not hard to track, and not hard to interpret what that means. So, talked about appetite and the correlation with stress and upper respiratory infection. And measure weight, at least at intake, and maybe at the time of movement to adoption, if that's something that often happens about a week later at the time of surgery. So that's really easy to track. Just put a scale in your intake room and put a scale wherever you do your move to adoption exam or in your surgery. Put that in your paperwork and report it to yourself. And even if it's not something that you do all year, every year, do a spot check. Do it for a month. Then try making a change, like giving bigger cages or changing your food or changing how you handle feeding and cleaning. And then do it for a month. And just see if you've made some progress. Big red flags. Death rate of greater than 2 or 3%, especially if it's other than little tiny kittens, or more than 5 to 10% of animals euthanized for shelter-acquired illness. Time to upper respiratory infection recovery of greater than 14 days, and a turnover time that's greater than the appropriate for your housing and capacity, and a URI rate of greater than 50% increase from baseline, or greater than 10 to 20% of your cap. Because what we know is that the best shelters, it can be under 10% of your intake. So here are some resources. And I actually have 5 minutes for questions. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I know, like, this last part, this making it happen is the hardest part. We really are making progress. There are shelters that are cutting holes in cages, that are dropping their turnover time, that are increasing their adoption numbers, and then now at least can share their success with us.